The engine roared as the plane taxied down the runway. But it wasn't the sound of the jet that made Elijah Simmons' heart race. It was the woman in the seat next to him. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But I'd prefer not to sit next to someone like you. Could you please move to another seat?" Elijah's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the woman sitting beside him in first class. She was a picture of privilege, perfectly styled blonde hair, a designer handbag perched on her lap, and a look of entitlement that could rival anyone in the room. She wasn't just asking him to move, she was ordering him, and all because of the color of his skin. But Elijah wasn't about to back down. "Pardon me," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "You're asking me to move because of what?" "Because I don't belong here." The woman didn't even flinch. She adjusted her sunglasses, leaned back in her chair, and said, "Yes, I don't think someone like you should be in first class. I'd feel more comfortable if you sat in economy with the rest of people like you." The words hung in the air like a slap. The audacity, the arrogance. And that's when the captain's voice came over the intercom, changing everything. The camera zooms in on Elijah's stern face, and the atmosphere shifts. The rest of the passengers watch as he remains calm, holding the weight of 1,000 silent judgments on his shoulders. Elijah had worked his whole life to get here, his seat, his opportunity, his moment to stand tall. But now, all of it was threatened by this woman's casual racism. The woman leaned back, visibly irritated by Elijah's refusal to comply. "If you don't move," she snapped, "I'll have you removed from this flight." Elijah's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. The woman was trying to make him invisible. She wanted to erase him from the luxury of first class. But Elijah Simmons wasn't someone who could be ignored any longer. The plane's engines hummed louder now, almost drowning out the tension building in the cabin. The woman's words were meant to diminish him, but they were only igniting a fire inside of him that he couldn't extinguish. She had made one fatal mistake, underestimating him. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Elijah's thoughts raced. He had come from nothing, raised in the tough parts of the city. He knew what it meant to be overlooked, to be underestimated, to be pushed aside like you didn't matter. But today, he was here in first class, and nobody, not even a woman like her, was going to make him feel less than. He took a deep breath, looking around the cabin at the passengers who were trying their best not to get involved. He could feel their eyes on him, some full of judgment, others full of curiosity. But most of them were hoping he would back down, just as they always did when faced with confrontation. He wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. "I'm not moving," he said firmly, his voice carrying through the cabin. "This is my seat, and I'm staying here." The woman's eyes widened. "You're making a mistake." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. The power had already shifted. And then, just as the plane was about to take off, the captain's voice boomed over the intercom again. "We are sorry to announce that there will be a slight delay. There's an issue that needs to be addressed before we can take off. Please remain seated." The entire plane fell silent. A few seconds passed, and then another voice crackled through the speaker. It was the flight attendant, his voice more urgent than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers please remain calm. We have a situation that requires immediate attention. We kindly ask for your cooperation." The woman beside Elijah shifted uncomfortably. Her confident posture faltered as she looked nervously at the flight attendant. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone suddenly not as arrogant as it had been before. The flight attendant, now standing by Elijah's seat, spoke clearly. "Ma'am, we've had a complaint about your behavior. We're requesting that you either relocate to another seat or exit the flight immediately." The woman's face drained of color. What do you mean? I haven't done anything wrong." Elijah could see her eyes scanning the room for an escape, but there was no running now. Her privilege couldn't protect her here. The entire plane was now watching her unravel. The tension in the cabin grew thicker as the flight attendants exchanged a few more words, their eyes darting between the woman and Elijah. The captain came on again, and this time, his words were more direct. "Due to a disruption caused by one of our passengers, we are grounding the plane. We will not be taking off until this matter is resolved." The woman, now red-faced, tried to argue, but her voice wavered. I demand to speak to the manager. This is outrageous. Do you know who I am? Elijah stood up slowly, not to make a scene, but to claim the power that was rightfully his. Do you know who I am? Elijah echoed her words, his voice cutting through the cabin. I am someone who doesn't let people like you decide where I belong. The flight attendants exchanged glances. One of them approached Elijah and quietly said, "Thank you, sir. We'll take it from here." As the woman was escorted off the plane, Elijah took a seat again, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and quiet satisfaction. The passengers around him, once passive observers, were now looking at him with new respect. Elijah knew this wasn't just about the seat. It was about something bigger. It was about standing up to the people who thought they could tear you down. It was about fighting back against an unjust system that wanted to label him, limit him, and push him into a box that didn't fit. The flight was delayed, but it no longer mattered. Elijah had won. He had earned his place, not just on this plane, but in the world. But as the woman's voice faded away, another thought crossed Elijah's mind. What happens when she comes back? As the plane finally took off, Elijah looked out the window, the city shrinking beneath him. He had made it, but deep down, he knew the battle was far from over. The airplane's engines hummed as the ground crew prepared for takeoff. Elijah sat in his seat, his hands gripping the armrests as he tried to steady his breath. The woman beside him had been escorted off the plane, but the unease that had settled in his stomach was still there, twisting. The flight attendant returned to the aisle, her eyes meeting Elijah's with a mix of sympathy and respect. "Thank you for your patience, sir. We'll be underway shortly." Elijah nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. What had just happened? A rich, entitled woman had tried to dismiss him, humiliate him for something as insignificant as his skin color, and he had fought back. He had won. But that victory felt hollow, too. He could feel eyes on him from every direction, passengers whose judgment he could already predict. They hadn't stood with him. They had watched. He sat back, running his fingers over the smooth surface of his phone, his mind swirling with questions. Who was this woman? Why had she tried to pull him down? And what would happen when the plane finally touched down? The voice of the captain suddenly interrupted his thoughts, crackling through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret the delay earlier. We appreciate your patience. We'll be in the air momentarily, but please be aware, the situation on board is being escalated. Please remain seated and stay calm." Elijah's blood ran cold. Escalated? Before he could process what was happening, the cabin door opened again, and in stepped two uniformed officers, their presence commanding attention. The flight attendant looked at Elijah, her expression unreadable, before giving the officers a small nod. This wasn't over. The officers made their way toward Elijah. The mood in the cabin shifted. The air felt thicker. The woman was gone, but her presence lingered like a shadow over the flight. "Elijah Simmons?" one of the officers asked, their voice stern but not unfriendly. "That's me," Elijah responded, his voice steady despite the rapid beating of his heart. "We need to speak with you," the officer continued, motioning for Elijah to follow them to the front of the plane. The murmurs from the other passengers grew louder as Elijah stood up, his mind racing. What now? He followed the officers down the narrow aisle, the eyes of the other passengers boring into his back. He had just been humiliated and removed from a seat for doing nothing more than existing. Was this some sort of payback? Was this a setup? He reached the front of the plane, where the captain was waiting. The officer turned to him and gestured to the seat across from the captain's chair. "Please sit. There's been some follow-up regarding your confrontation with the passenger earlier." Elijah sat, his palms sweating as the captain stood next to him. The plane had begun taxiing once again, the wheels rumbling beneath him. "I don't understand what this is about," Elijah said, his voice filled with confusion. "I thought it was all over. She's off the plane. What else do you need from me?" The captain exchanged a look with one of the officers before answering. "We're not here to punish you, Elijah. In fact, we're grateful for your actions. But there's more going on here than meets the eye. That woman, she's more than just an angry passenger." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Who is she?" The captain hesitated before answering. Her name is Vanessa Wilkes. She's the head of public relations for Wilkes Enterprises, one of the largest corporations in the country. She's connected. Very connected. Elijah stared at him, disbelief washing over him. Vanessa Wilkes? The woman who had humiliated him on a whim. What are you telling me? Elijah asked, trying to process the new information. That she's some sort of big shot. Yes, the officer replied. And this isn't just about you sitting in first class. The truth is, you've just inadvertently become part of a much larger issue. Elijah's mind raced as the reality of the situation set in. He had taken a stand against racism and arrogance, and now the ramifications were far more complicated than he'd ever expected. You see, the captain continued, Vanessa Wilkes has been part of a series of discriminatory incidents that have come to light recently. Her company has been under investigation for alleged unethical business practices, but she's managed to avoid any scrutiny, until now. A sinking feeling gnawed at Elijah's stomach. He had been caught in the crossfire of something much larger than he could have imagined. Her actions on this flight, trying to humiliate you, asking you to move based on your race, are part of a broader pattern of behavior, the officer added. We've been monitoring her movements for weeks. She's been using her power to push people down, to take away opportunities from those she deems unworthy. But this incident has forced our hand. Elijah sat back in his chair, processing everything he had just learned. Vanessa wasn't just some random, privileged woman with a big mouth. She was part of a system that used her power to keep people like him in their place. She had thought he would simply back down, but he hadn't. And now things were escalating. Elijah was in the middle of something bigger than just a plain ride. He was becoming a part of a fight for justice that stretched far beyond this moment. Are you telling me that this is just about the flight? Elijah asked, the pieces starting to fall into place. That it's about her and her company? The captain nodded. That's right. We've been alerted to multiple instances of misconduct involving her and her colleagues. And now, your actions have brought all of this into the open. We've grounded the plane to investigate further. And now, because of his actions, the spotlight was on her. But the question remained, how far would this go? Just as Elijah thought he might finally have a moment to breathe, the officer spoke again. There's one more thing, Mr. Simmons, he said, his voice low. This investigation is about to get even more complicated. There are forces at play here that you haven't even begun to understand. And Vanessa Wilkes? She's not the only person in power that's been exposed. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. Is there something I should know? Elijah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The officer met his gaze with a grim look. Just get ready. This is far from over, and what happens next could change everything. Elijah's pulse raced as the officer's words hung in the air. There are forces at play here that you haven't even begun to understand. He sat frozen in his seat, the weight of the situation settling over him like a cloud, dense and suffocating. The airplane was still on the tarmac, the engine's hum now eerily quiet as the moment stretched into what felt like eternity. The officers had left him alone for a moment, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. All eyes were on Elijah, some out of curiosity, others with judgment. He could feel the stares from the passengers. He was no longer just a man on a flight. Now, he was part of something much larger, an investigation that was shaking the foundation of power. But Elijah wasn't sure whether he was part of a revolution or just another pawn in a much darker game. This is far from over, the officer had said. The words replayed in Elijah's mind. His stomach twisted. What had he really stepped into? Just then, the door to the cockpit opened. One of the officers reappeared, her face grim. She motioned for Elijah to follow her. Elijah, we need to speak with you again, the officer said, her voice low. He stood, his heart pounding in his chest, and followed her down the aisle. He didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. The questions swirling in his mind were only multiplying. As he reached the front of the plane, Elijah saw the captain, standing near the exit with a dark expression on his face. Mr. Simmons, the captain said, extending his hand. I'm sorry we had to delay everything, but there's a bigger picture at play here. We need you to trust us. Elijah's eyes narrowed, but he took the captain's hand. He wasn't sure what was going on anymore, but he needed answers. What's really happening? Why am I being pulled into this? Elijah asked, his voice filled with urgency. The captain exchanged a look with the officer, then turned to Elijah. We're grounded for a reason. This goes way beyond the flight, beyond Vanessa Wilkes. Your actions have put you in the middle of a situation that we're still trying to piece together. Elijah's stomach twisted. What situation? The officer stepped forward. You're not just a bystander in this, Mr. Simmons. You're a part of something much bigger than you realize. There are files, corporate documents, emails, recordings, all pointing to some very powerful people who are involved in discriminatory practices. And Vanessa Wilkes is at the center of it. But she's not the only one. Elijah felt like he had been hit by a truck. The woman who had humiliated him on the plane was just a small piece of the puzzle. There were more people involved, more powerful, more dangerous people who had been hiding behind their wealth and influence. Who else is involved? Elijah demanded. He had to know. He had to understand why his simple act of standing up for himself had turned into this massive investigation. The officer hesitated before answering. There's a much larger web of corruption, Mr. Simmons. Vanessa Wilkes is just the tip of the iceberg. Her connections reach deep into the corporate world, into politics, and even law enforcement. The higher-ups at Wilkes Enterprises have been using their power to silence people, to oppress them. And it's not just about race. It's about power, control, and money. Elijah's mind raced. Power, control, money. Those words had haunted his life for years. The systems of oppression he had faced his entire existence, the barriers he had fought to overcome, they were all part of a system that kept people like him in the shadows, unseen and unheard. And now he was in the middle of it, in the light. The officer continued. The truth is, Vanessa Wilkes never expected you to fight back. She didn't think you'd make a scene, let alone challenge her in front of all those people. That's why she's connected. She's used to getting what she wants. But now, the entire plane is grounded. The investigation has started, and things are escalating faster than we anticipated. Elijah's thoughts raced, and his mind flashed back to the words that had stung him when he first entered the plane. This is my seat, not yours. That was how it had started. The dehumanization, the assumption that he wasn't worthy of a seat in first class. But now, everything had changed. He had fought back, and now Vanessa Wilkes and her powerful connections were at risk of being exposed. But would it be enough? Would Elijah's bravery lead to justice? Or was he just a pawn in a game far bigger than him? As he turned to ask more questions, he saw the door open again. 2 more officers entered the plane, their expressions tense and urgent. One of them approached the captain. We've got a problem, the officer said, his voice low. The higher-ups want to shut this down. They're pulling strings. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, pulling strings? The officer's eyes flicked toward Elijah, his expression conflicted. People are watching. Powerful people. And they don't like what's happening. We're trying to stop them, but there's only so much we can do. They want to sweep this under the rug. They want to make you disappear. Elijah felt his blood run cold. He had stepped into something dangerous, something that threatened to take everything from him. His job, his reputation, his future. You can't let them silence me, Elijah said, his voice shaking with intensity. This is bigger than a plane ride. This is about everything, about standing up, about not letting them walk all over us. You can't let them sweep this under the rug. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them sighed. We're trying, Mr. Simmons, but the forces at play here are much bigger than you realize. Just as he was about to respond, there was a loud noise from the front of the plane. The cabin suddenly went dark, and Elijah's heart raced in panic. The plane shuddered, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire world was collapsing in on him. What's happening? Elijah asked, his voice trembling. The captain and the officers looked at each other, their expressions grim. We're being forced to land, the captain said quietly. The authorities are stepping in. This is bigger than we thought. Elijah's eyes widened. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The game was no longer just about him and Vanessa Wilkes. This was about power. This was about control, As the plane began its descent, Elijah took a deep breath. The journey was far from over, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The sudden jolt of the plane as it touched down sent a shockwave through the cabin, and the tension that had been building since the first moment of conflict between Elijah and Vanessa Wilkes finally hit its peak. Elijah's heart hammered in his chest, and the reality of what was happening, what he had gotten involved in, finally hit him. The authorities were here now. This wasn't just about his personal dignity anymore. This was about power, corruption, and control, and the fight for justice was no longer optional. It was inevitable. As the plane taxied toward the gate, the dim lights in the cabin flickered back on. The murmurs from the other passengers grew louder, the tension in the air palpable. Elijah glanced around, noting the mixed reactions. Some looked nervous, others confused, while a few whispered among themselves as if they were afraid to ask the question everyone was wondering. What happens now? Elijah wasn't sure what to expect either. Vanessa Wilkes sat across from him, her face a mask of disbelief. The woman who had once looked at him like he was unworthy of even a seat in first class now had a look in her eyes he could only describe as fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of exposure, and maybe, just maybe, fear of the consequences she'd soon face for her actions. The officers who had boarded earlier were now stationed at the front of the cabin, their stern expressions giving away nothing. But Elijah knew they were prepared for whatever came next. He had become the centerpiece of a fight much bigger than he could have imagined when he stepped onto this plane. As the door opened and the jet bridge connected, 2 more law enforcement officers stepped on, followed by a man in a tailored suit Elijah didn't recognize. He walked straight toward the front, where Vanessa sat, now stiff with tension. He was tall, with dark features and a cold, professional demeanor that matched the authority he exuded. Elijah immediately knew he was important, maybe even powerful, and his appearance only confirmed what the officer had told him earlier. Forces were at play that Elijah didn't fully understand. The man's eyes flicked over to Elijah as he walked past, then quickly back to Vanessa. There was a sharpness in his gaze, but no words passed between them. The officer who had been speaking to Elijah earlier approached the suited man. "Is everything in place?" the officer asked. The man nodded, glancing back at Elijah. "The documentation is ready. We have enough to move forward." Elijah's mind was still spinning, but hearing those words gave him the faintest sense of hope. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about exposing the system, about making sure no one else would have to endure the humiliating, dehumanizing behavior that Vanessa Wilkes and her associates had been so comfortable displaying. Vanessa, on the other hand, looked like she had been struck by lightning. The reality of the situation seemed to be sinking in. She tried to stand, but the officer moved in quickly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Stay seated, ma'am," he said. "You're not going anywhere." Her face contorted with frustration, and for the first time, Elijah saw a crack in the facade of the confident, arrogant woman who had made his life so difficult. He wasn't sure whether to feel pity or triumph. Pity for someone so entrenched in their privilege, they couldn't imagine a world where their behavior didn't go unchecked. Triumph, because he had fought back. He had stood up for himself in a way he'd never thought possible. The suit-wearing man turned to the passengers who had been sitting silently, observing the unfolding drama. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience. This flight is part of an ongoing investigation into a pattern of corporate misconduct and discriminatory behavior." Gasps filled the cabin. Elijah could feel every pair of eyes now focused on him. The moment had shifted. Vanessa, the woman who had tried to make him invisible, was now the one under the microscope. "We are proceeding with legal actions," the man continued, "and all passengers will need to remain on board for further questioning. We ask for your patience and cooperation as we ensure that justice is served." Elijah's heart skipped a beat as the words registered. Justice. The word echoed in his mind. For once, justice wasn't an abstract idea. It was here. It was happening. And for once, the tables had turned. As the man finished speaking, Elijah's eyes locked with Vanessa's. She had been reduced to silence, her defiance snuffed out by the weight of the law that was now moving in to hold her accountable. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on them both, but for once, he didn't care. He had nothing to prove to anyone here. This moment wasn't about validation from strangers. It was about the fact that the system had been forced to acknowledge the wrongs it had allowed to fester. Minutes later, the officers began to move through the cabin, asking questions, taking statements. Elijah sat back, trying to process everything. He had no idea what would happen next, but he did know one thing. The fight wasn't over. Vanessa Wilkes wasn't the only person whose actions needed to be held accountable. There were still those who thought they could hide behind their money and power. Still those who believed they could control the narrative. But not anymore. As Elijah stood up to speak with an officer, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a news alert. Breaking news. CEO of Wilkes Enterprises investigated for discriminatory practices after public incident on flight. Elijah felt a rush of vindication. The story was already going public. The world was about to see what had really been going on behind the scenes. What Vanessa and her kind had thought they could bury was coming to light. Just as the officer finished taking his statement, Elijah noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Vanessa Wilkes had been escorted off the plane. Her head hung low, her face pale. But just before she disappeared through the jet bridge, their eyes met one last time. And in that fleeting moment, Elijah knew that the fight had been worth it. The woman who had humiliated him, the woman who had reduced him to nothing more than an object of her disdain, was being held accountable. And the system that had protected her, had protected people like her, was beginning to crack. Justice had been served today, but there were still so many more battles to fight. If you believe in standing up for what's right, if you've ever had to fight for your place in this world, share this story. Leave a comment below and let us know what you think of Elijah's fight for justice. What would you have done in his shoes? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that remind us how important it is to always stand up, no matter how big the odds are.